Welcome to Season 1, Episode 3 of Let's Build a Startup. I'm your host and founder, Serge Torka, and in this series, we're building a completely open company. In the last episode, we did a deep dive into our company's mission. We're going to try to build an improved education system for early childhood learning, and our goal is that it should work even for those kids that get very unlucky in terms of who they're born to or the environment that they grow up in. We want even those very unlucky children to have access to a great education. We also looked at some of the problems in the current educational system and explored some solutions for how we might tackle those problems. However, we didn't cover any of the finances, and that's what we're going to cover this episode. So our goal is to try to take all those ideas that we had in the last episode and put them together into a business model that does not lose money. The reason this is so important is that businesses that lose money have a finite lifespan. So as soon as the founders or the investors stop putting new money into that business, it dies. So if we're trying to solve a really important problem and we want to make sure that that problem continues being solved into the future, we really want to find a way to make it profitable. That way we can harness the greed of other individuals to push our company to solve the mission. Switching back to my idea list here, the very first question we want to answer when designing a business model is who benefits from our product. So in our case, it's who benefits from a great education. And the reason we want to answer this question is because it will tell us who our customers are. The folks that benefit the most from your product are also generally going to be the folks that are willing to pay the most, all else being equal. And so we really want to answer this question so that we understand who our customers are. And so who benefits? The first person that benefits is the student. We saw in the last episode that there is a direct correlation between the literacy levels of adults and the yearly income that they make. And so the student greatly benefits from education. The next folks that benefit are the parents and the student's friends and close family. Generally, it's good to have smart people around. Those smart people not only will be more interesting to have conversations with, but they'll also be wealthier because of that correlation. And so when you're around them, you're going to be eating at nicer restaurants. When you go to their house, you're going to be staying in a nicer place. And so there are general benefits to having smart people around you. The next group that benefits from a great education is the local community. When a community has lots of educated people, there are lots of benefits. The level of crime is lower, the amount of wealth in the community is higher because each of those people is earning more money, the property values go up, and so on. There are lots of benefits. The next group that benefits is the government, and this applies to every level of government. So municipal, state, and federal governments all benefit from having an educated populace. The benefits are similar to that of the local community, except for one major difference, which is that governments collect taxes. In the previous episode, we actually estimated just how much extra tax revenue US governments would be able to collect by educating people, and they're huge numbers. It's like $500 billion in tax revenue per year. So if we could solve education, that would be extremely valuable to governments. Now, there is one important caveat here, which is that the government that invests in you to educate you is not always the same one that collects the tax revenue once you've become a productive member and once you enter the workforce. For example, if I graduate at age 18 and I move to some other place, the government that paid for my schooling isn't collecting, but they put up all the money to educate me. And that's something that's important to keep in the back of our heads as we're thinking through the business model. And the final group of people that benefit from education, probably more than any other group here, are rich people. And I put here investors and founders. And the reason is that they own pretty much all the companies. And so if you have a pool of very educated individuals in the population to hire from, you're going to be able to build better companies. The crime rate is going to be lower. And so your security costs for maintaining that company is going to be lower. And so there are all kinds of benefits to rich people. Now that we know who our customers are, let's explore some business ideas. The first one is to run for office. And this was suggested to me by a friend of mine. It's not really a business idea, but it is an idea nonetheless. And so I think it's worth exploring. So the idea here would be that I would get elected somewhere and I would top down just impose my school system, wherever I got elected. Now, there are a few reasons that this isn't a great idea. The first is that I'm not a politician. I really don't like political games. I'm just an engineer, and I definitely could not lie in order to get elected, which seems to be required these days. And so I'd judge my own chances of getting elected to be very near to zero. The other problem is that the amount of bureaucracy involved in solving this politically is just enormous. The closest that I've been to a political position is I was the vice president of my condo board. And there were only 5 people on that board, but the amount of time that was wasted on arguing about stupid little things was just enormous. We would have like 3-hour meetings for something that could have been resolved in 2 minutes. And so I just see that even if I wanted to go this route and I was successfully elected, it would just take, decades to solve this problem. So my plan is not to try to solve this politically, at least for now, but instead through a business. And so first, let's take a look at the cost to run an existing school or a school district so that we just get a ballpark idea of what kind of numbers we're dealing with. So I'm looking here at the budget for the Pittsburgh public school system, and this is a mid-sized US city, so it gives us a reasonable estimate of the kinds of numbers that we'd be looking at if we were to run a typical school. The first thing that we see here is that the total expenses is $685 million, and that covers the education for about 20,350 students. Now that cost breaks down into 50 million or so of debt servicing costs. So this is the repaying some debts that they had in the past. And of the rest of the expenses, about 2/3 of it is spent on instruction. So this is like teachers. And then 1/3 is spent on support and admin services. So things like, operation and maintenance of plant services. So this is the building, paying for maintenance of the building, transportation services, pupil health. So this is like the school nurse, administration. So all kinds of extra stuff that is not directly related to teaching. One thing that stands out to me here is that the operation of maintenance and plant services, 68 million, that is 10% of the entire budget, which seems very high to me. And so I'm not sure why exactly it's that high, but we'll look at it in our own numbers to see if we can't improve on that. The other thing that I'm not sure how this splits up is the food cost. So in the US, my understanding is that every student gets free lunch and breakfast every day. And I don't see any budget item specifically for food here. The closest would be something like pupil health, but at only $10 million per year, that roughly equates to $2 per student per day for both lunch and breakfast, and that seems way too low to me to be possible. And so I'm not sure where exactly the food cost is in this spreadsheet, and it is probably a significant cost, and so I'm surprised that I don't see a specific line item for it. So we're going to take all of these numbers and plug them into a spreadsheet. And so what we did here is we took the instructional expenses, so this is this top line number here, 421 million, and we divided that by the total number of students, and we get $20,000 of instructional expenses per student. And for a classroom of 20 kids, that means we get $400,000 to build a classroom. And this is for public schools. Now, if we include all the expenses, so all the support costs, then the cost does rise a bit. It's $33,000 per student, which seems really high to me. That's per year. So every student, the government pays $33,000 to the public school to educate that child. And even if we remove the debt servicing costs here, so it would be $30,000 per student. And so for a classroom of 20 kids, that ends up being $673,000, which is that's an astronomical number to me. I did not think that it was this high. What we also did is we took the charter schools. For those that are not familiar with charter schools in the US, they are essentially a competitor to public schools. So anybody in the community can build a charter school, and for every student that they educate, the state will pay them a fixed amount of money for that student. And the amount of money is supposed to be as much as the public schools get for their students, but in practice, it tends to be a little bit less. So you can see here that the public school system budgets $20,000 per student, but the charter schools in Pennsylvania get about $15,000 per student. So it's only about 75% of the budget. And so for the charter schools, they have $300,000 of instructional budget for a class of 20 kids. And the important thing to note here is that the charter schools are not required to cover the extra expenses. So there are various expenses like student transportation and building maintenance that are supposed to be covered by the school district and not by the individual charter school. And so that's why we're looking only at instructional expenses for the charter school. And I got these numbers from this site here. I assume they're accurate. I don't see a reason that they would lie. So it just shows how many students and how much total tuition was paid to the charter schools for those students. So now that we have a rough ballpark for the budget of a typical school, we're going to look at our school and try to fit it within that budget. And The important thing is that we're looking only at variable costs. So these are costs that depend on how many students you have. So if we doubled the number of students, we would expect these costs to also double. The reason we're not looking at fixed costs, like the cost of building the curriculum in the first place, is because if we're profitable on a variable cost basis or on a unit cost basis, that means that every child we add to our school is making money. And so as long as our volume is large enough, the profit from the variable costs will overwhelm the fixed startup cost that we have. And so we'll be overall profitable. So the first variable cost we have is our teacher. And if you remember from the last video, our goal is to make sure that we pay teachers a very competitive salary, where a brilliant engineer who is deciding between working at Google and working as a teacher, there's a chance that they actually choose working as a teacher. And so we allocated $125,000 to the teacher. And if we look at the salary levels for somebody working at Google, we see that an entry level at Google is $144,000 base salary with $183,000 total salary. And so we are not quite as competitive at Google. But one thing to keep in mind is that typically Google requires you to live in a high cost of living area, whereas we're targeting communities where the cost of living is much lower. And so this might actually be competitive on a disposable income basis. And as we'll see later, there's actually room for this to go up substantially. The next thing we're going to look at is the amount of student equipment. So this should cover things like laptops, 1 laptop per child per year. And we looked last time at this laptop. It's $70. It comes with a stylus on Amazon. And so that's $70 per child per year. We're assuming that they'll break every year. And then, any other costs like pencils, paper, etc. And so we're assuming $300 per student per year. The next variable cost is our school equipment. And so we're budgeting that at $5,000. This is supposed to be things like, when a chair or a desk breaks, you have to replace it. When you need to replace a teacher's laptop, or there's projectors in a classroom, or chalkboards or chalk, or whatever it is that the school needs to continually replace. Next is rent. And so rent, we're assuming here that we have 1,000 square feet. Now, most classrooms are about 700 square feet, not 1,000 square feet. But we know that, if we have a building with 20 classrooms, there's a lot of common area between those classrooms, and we should assign some portion of that common area to each classroom. And so we're saying that roughly, if we split that common area up between all of the classrooms, we'll have 1,000 square feet per classroom of, the total building size. And at $25 per square foot per year, that comes out to $25,000 in rent. And the way that I chose this $25 per square foot per year is I went to LoopNet and I searched for office space under $20 a square foot. And I can see that even under $20 a square foot, I can find reasonably nice office space. And so, if we're paying $25 a square foot, we should be able to get a nice school. And then there's also utilities. So we're budgeting $5 per square foot per year for utilities. And so that's another $5,000. The next variable cost we have is some helpers. So if you remember, in a traditional model, there's one teacher that's teaching to the entire class. But in our model, we want to make sure that the teacher has lots of one-on-one time with the students. So we're hiring an expert level teacher, and at least 6 hours a day, they're going to be spending with 1 or 2 students. So very direct attention to each of the students. And so that means the other 19 kids in the class or 18 kids in the class, they need somebody to supervise them and work with them and make sure that, they're not just hurting each other or whatever it is. And so for that, we need some helpers. And this is actually a budget for an age 2 class. So a class where all the kids are around age 2 to 3. And so because of that, I budgeted 2 helpers. And I figured that the teacher plus the 2 helpers should be able to manage a class of 22-year-olds. But this cost will actually go down as you get older, right? For example, a grade 3 class probably does not need 2 helpers. They probably can get away with 1 helper and 1 teacher. And by the time you're in grade 7, you can probably just do the teacher alone. So as the classroom ages, the teacher, they start teaching 2-year-olds, and so they're earning $125,000 a year. But as the classroom ages, the teacher's earning more because you no longer need these helpers. And so by the time the kids are like 12 years old, all of that $100,000 that was previously going to the helpers in younger grades is now going to the teacher. And so that becomes very competitive with something like Google. Next, we have the payment to the parents. So if you remember on the last video, we discussed that our unlucky child, the model child that we're solving for, they have their dad in jail and their single mom is working 2 jobs. And so in order to get the mom to take time off work, right? Because if she takes time off work and she doesn't get paid for that time, she won't be able to make rent. And so we have to pay her for her time to come in and talk to the teacher every month. And the idea is every day after the class ends, the teacher will spend 30 minutes talking with one of the students' parents. And so over a month, they can cover all 20 parents. And so every parent gets 1 day per month with the teacher, and we pay them on average $50 to come in for that 30 minutes. And that $50 makes it so that it's worth it for the parent to show up. And it also incentivizes the parent because it's not going to be an exact $50. It's going to be calibrated to be average 50, but based on the student's progress. And so it'll also incentivize the parent to work a little bit with their kid at home. It's not a huge payment, but there is some incentive there. And so if we average $50 per month per parent, we get a yearly cost for the class of $10,000. Now, the next 2 sections we put at a variable cost of 0. So this is software and licensing fees and the curriculum. Remember, we're going to digitize the entire curriculum. And so these are things that we are going to build in order to make the business more efficient. And I don't know the exact costs that schools pay for software, and I think it differs depending on the school district. But if I break down this regular programs of instruction, you can see that there is other purchase services is $127 million per year. And so I don't know exactly what that covers, but probably there are, some portion of that is software. And so we want to make sure that the cost of that goes to 0 because that'll make our business a lot more efficient, and we can allocate a higher percentage of our budget to the teacher and to the helper. So we want as much one-on-one time with the kids as possible. Then we want to add $10,000 a year for the training of the teacher. So remember, we are hiring expert level teachers, and we are going to invest in the teachers to be the best teachers that they can be. And so we want to make sure that we are paying for them to get better at their skills and better at teaching. And so the idea is maybe every summer or maybe during the night, they're taking extra classes to become better teachers, or they're reviewing other teachers or something. And so we're going to need to pay for that training. And finally, this is what I do in every budget that I make, is I allocate some proportion of it. So this is about 10% of error. And this just covers in case we made a mistake, which we almost certainly have made mistakes here. This is supposed to cover those mistakes because, again, these are ballpark figures. And so with this budget, we get a total expense for instructional expenses of $311,000. And assuming we get what the typical charter school gets, we would have a profit of $2,820, which is just about 1%. And this is a low margin business. So you can build 2 types of businesses that will be successful. You either have a low margin, high volume business. So this is something like Amazon or a grocery store, where on each item you're making maybe 1%, but the amount of items that you sell is so high that it makes up for it. Or you can have a high margin business that sells to a low number of customers, something like an enterprise software product, where your margins are like 90, 95%, but you only have a few hundred customers. And so our margin here is very low. And so in order to really make a profitable system with this budget, we would have to really expand to as many schools as possible. But we also do want to increase margins over time by making the business more efficient. Now, it's important that as we try to increase margins, that we don't do it, for example, by taking away salary from the teacher, because that's going to impact the student's learning. And so we want to find clever ways to increase our margins without sacrificing our mission. And we'll explore some of those later in the episode. Now, just for fun, I also ran the numbers for what it would look like if we had full control of the public school's budget. So the public school gets $673,000 for each class of 20 kids, but they have to cover other stuff like administration and food and transportation. Again, we're not exactly sure about food, and so that's why I have some error here. So here is where I think the real profit opportunity lies, is if we could get the entire budget, I think we could run a much more efficient business where our margins would be like 20%. And I think the reason that these costs are so high for the school districts is because, again, there are lots of middlemen that are lots of vendors that are taking their cut, and there's chains of middlemen, each one taking their cut. And so the cost that a school pays for some of these services, I think, are really inflated. So for transportation, I actually didn't change this at all. So the per student cost from here, if I look at the transportation, so they spent, how much did they spend? They spent $35 million on 20,000 students. And so I just took that exact number and just did it for 20 kids. And so transportation, we're not going to try to make more efficient. I think that's probably already efficient because typically the drivers are very close to the school. Now for food, the way that I calculated it is that, at $10 a day, I think we can definitely cover the ingredients for the food. And so if there's $10 per day per student with 190 days in the year, we get $38,000 per classroom in food costs. And then we also need to spend $20,000 on preparing that food. So we have to pay a cook to actually come in and prepare the food for that class of 20 kids. And I estimate that for a class, like if we take the fractional budget that we have to pay to a cook, it'd be about $20,000 to prepare all the meals for 20 kids. Then we have a bunch of administrative work. This, I estimate just from my own businesses, that it would be about $50,000 for a class of 20 kids. So again, you're not hiring a full nurse for one class. You're hiring maybe one nurse for the entire school, one principal for the entire school. You have like legal, accounting, audits, etc. You have lots of administrative overhead. And I'm estimating that at $50,000 per classroom. And then I'm estimating special education at $50,000. So one of the challenges with our one-on-one based curriculum is that if the teacher is doing one-on-one with every child, then for the kids that, if they have disabilities or special needs, this teacher is not going to be well prepared to handle them because they need to make sure that they're speaking to every child. And so we need special teachers that will work just with the kids with special needs. And I estimate those to be at about $50,000 per classroom. So if we have one special needs child in every classroom, then probably for $100,000, we can get a teacher that will only have 2 kids. So the goal of the special education teacher is to take the load off of the main teacher who is doing all their one-on-one time with kids that can keep up. And finally, again, we want to take the software and licensing fees for the administration down to 0. There are a lot of software vendors that I know have great margins on what the schools pay them. And so if we can take this down to 0, that translates to significant savings for the individual school. And again, we add an error just because we're certainly wrong about some of these. And so we want to make sure that we estimate that, the costs are going to be more than what they actually are here. And so our total expenses comes out to $528,000, which leaves $144,000 worth of profit per class of 20 kids. So these margins look incredible. This is, you're getting a 20% margin on running a school. And so if we could somehow convince a state to just give us the full budget for a public school, I think we could run a significantly more efficient operation just by eliminating all of these middlemen that are, selling software and various other services and IP. And finally, let's move on to our fixed costs. So these are fixed costs for one school. And the way that we want to do this is we want to take, in the first year, we're going to build 1 or 2 classrooms. We want to keep it really small so that we can iterate, because there are lots of things in my assumptions here that are incorrect. And so we need the first year to basically be as tight as possible, where I would be working directly in the classroom and observing the teacher and the helpers and how everything fits together, and just fixing any mistakes that I see to just make the process really efficient. And after the first year, so in the second year, we're going to expand to a full school. So we're going to take a small 15,000 square foot school, which is about 15 classrooms. And so what we want is we need enough funding to make that first school work. So for the first 2 years. And what that looks like is, so in a low cost of living community, we can buy a nice building. So a building where the foundation is really solid and just the interior maybe needs work, for about $500,000. And then we are budgeting $500,000 for the renovations to that school. And $500,000 for 15,000 square feet, that's about $35 a square foot, which is on the low end of commercial renovations. But what we are taking into account here is that these are low cost of living communities. So the cost of labor is significantly lower than what you might expect in New York or San Francisco. And so spending $500,000 in a low cost of living community is the same as spending like $1 million in a high cost of living community. And that takes you actually to above average for the renovations. And so you could build a nice school for $1 million in a low cost of living community. And finally, we need to build the curriculum. Remember, we are trying to digitize the curriculum so that we enable the teacher to do all of this one-on-one time instead of having to teach each individual student. And so for that, we need to hire developers to build out these modules that will automatically evaluate students on their skills. And we also need to hire content producers to make sure that there is content for all of these different lessons that we're trying to teach for places that are not already covered. So I know Khan Academy covers a lot of stuff, but there are things, especially with early childhood education, that in my opinion are not well covered by Khan Academy. And so for one grade, I would estimate we need about $2 million in development costs to build out the curriculum. And remember in the first episode, I talked about how it's valuable to break down a large problem into small profitable chunks. And so our goal here is to only build one grade of curriculum with this first round of funding. That way we can prove the success of the system. And when we prove success, it'll be much easier to raise the next round of funding. And so the first round that we need to build one grade worth of curriculum and to build the first school is $3 million. And so that's what we're going to aim for. Now that we have a rough estimate of the budget required to run a school, let's look at the ways that we might be able to run it. So the first is through a private school. The way a typical private school works is you build your school and you charge tuition for the children that are attending. So the families of the children have to pay. Now that obviously doesn't work for our model user. Our model user, their dad is in jail and their mom is working 2 jobs. And so she cannot afford to send that kid to private school. And so the unlucky children just don't have access to the system. But there is a model that might work to enable our unlucky child to get in. So let's switch to my tablet here. And so let's say we have a class of 20 kids. Now the first 18 slots are going to be free slots that you have to compete for with an entry evaluation. So we try to find all of the Einsteins in the population and try to get them into our school. The remaining 2 slots are going to be paid for slots and they're going to be very expensive. Remember, from our who benefits, rich people benefit. And so we want rich people to pay for the school. And so those last 2 slots, they're also going to be a competition. So there's going to be an evaluation, but it's only going to include families that are willing to pay $150,000 per year for their child to attend. And so there are going to be 2 families that pay the $150,000, and that gets us the $300,000 that we need in our budget to run our school. Now, the tricky part here is why would a family be willing to pay $150,000 for their kid to go to a school? Very few people can pay that. You need to be part of like the 0.1%. And the reason is that we are going to select the absolute best kids to get into our school. So you're not going to school with just anybody. You're going to school with the best people that we could find. And this is going to make it so that when your child grows up, your rich child, when they grow up, they're going to be extremely well connected with extremely productive people. The problem with this model is that right now, I'm just some guy on YouTube and I have no credibility yet. And so nobody is going to reasonably expect that I can build this great school that can attract the best people. And in order for this to work, you really need to first build out a track record of building exceptional schools. And after that, you can recruit these rich people to pay you. So this model is a clever idea, but it doesn't work until year 4 or 5 when we already have shown results that we know what we're talking about. The next option for how we might build the system is through charter schools. And so like I explained before, a charter school is a competitor to a public school and it gets money from the state. So the state pays the students' tuition. The first is that we cannot select which kids we allow into our school. So we cannot have a charter school that is dedicated, for example, to kids with a talent in math, because we wouldn't be able to run that entry evaluation to just select those kids that are really good at math. And so we have to allow everybody in the region access to our charter school. And the only way, if there's an overflow of kids, if there are too many, we have to pick them by lottery. The other problem with charter schools is that they must all be not-for-profits. And in some states, they are very limited in the kinds of relationships that they can have with for-profit companies. And the reason that that's a problem for us is because we need private capital to invest in order to build our school and build our better curriculum. And so if this private capital cannot expect to have their money returned, then they're not going to invest. And so that's really a problem for us. Now, there are states that do allow private capital to earn a return. And so what we can do is we can start with those states, and later, as better policy measures are adopted, then we can expand to those states that currently wouldn't allow us to operate. And we'll talk more about policy measures in the last part of this video. The other way that we might build this education system is by working directly with the public schools. So instead of trying to build something that competes with them in parallel, we would try to convince either the teachers or the administration to adopt our methodology. The problem with this is that we'd be doing it as an outsider, and the level of change that we want to make, like these are really big changes in how a school is run. And so it would be very difficult to persuade teachers to do this, or the administration to do this, if we don't already have a model that works that we can just show them and say, hey, here's this school that has way better results than all the other schools in the region. What are they doing differently? And if we do it that way, then there's a chance that they copy us. But if we try to convince them without an example of how we did it, it's not going to work. And so this would be good after we already have a working model. So of the three options that we have in order to build these schools, I think by far the most preferable is going down the charter school route. And the reason for that is that charter schools give us full control of the curriculum. So we would be able to make these large changes to how we teach the students. And we would immediately have revenue from the governments, because the governments are the ones that are paying the tuition for the kids. And so we don't need to convince individual parents to send their kids to our school and pay large sums of money. And so at least at the beginning, we're gonna pursue the charter schools. Next, let's explore how we might be able to increase these margins. So right now we're only making $3,000 of profit per classroom. And so if we look at a 15,000 square foot school, so that's 15 classrooms, that's only about $45,000 per year in profit. And if you divide that by the 3 million in investment that was put in, that's just an extremely low return. So we need to find a way to improve these margins so that it's worth it for investors to deploy their capital to help us build these schools. The first idea for how we might be able to attract private capital to come and help us build these schools is through forced appreciation of nearby land. So the idea is that investors, in addition to building the school, before it's built, they would buy up a bunch of land in the neighborhood. And then after we build the school, if we're successful and it's actually a great school, then the prices of property in that neighborhood will rise dramatically. And so the investor, if after 5 years we've tripled the value of property prices, they can then sell for a nice return. And if we go down this path, the investor would also have a negative holding cost. With most assets, in order to hold them, you're actually losing money. So if you take a bar of gold, you have to pay every month in order to secure it so it doesn't get stolen. And so even if you sell it for a higher price at the end, that might actually be a net loss because you've been paying monthly to have it secured. Well, if you're buying land, you can rent it out while you're holding it. And if the rent is cash flow positive, the investor is actually earning money while holding it to appreciation. So this is a really cool model where it directly aligns the incentives of the investor with the incentives of the community. They are literally investing in the community to make it better, and once they've succeeded in making it better, they can cash out, which is exactly what the community wants. So the next way that we might be able to make money is through the McDonald's leasing model. So the way the McDonald's Corporation earns money is not just through the franchisees paying them a fraction of their revenue, but also McDonald's owns the land and the building out of which the franchisee is operating the business. And so the franchisee is paying rent every month to McDonald's. And if we go back to our budget, we see that we have the opportunity to do the same thing. In our budget, the school is paying $25,000 per classroom per year in rent. And for a school of 15 classrooms, that's $375,000 per year in rent. And for example, the following deal might be extremely attractive for investors. So they put in $500K for the building and then $500K for renovations. And then they got to put in $2 million to build the first grade of curriculum. And so They put in $3 million, and out of that, they get $375K in rent per year. So that's a cap rate of about 12%. So that's decent, but not outstanding. But look what happens when we build multiple schools. Remember that our $2 million for the curriculum is a fixed cost that can be amortized across all schools. So what happens if they build a 30-class school? So they invest $1 million for the school, $1 million for the renovations, and $2 million for the curriculum. And so that's $4 million in total. But now our rent has doubled. So that's $750K. And so we've gone from a cap rate of 12% to a cap rate of nearly 20%. And this keeps improving the more schools that you build. But wait, there's one more thing. Remember that this rent is backed by the government. It's paying all of the students' tuition. And so it's virtually impossible for your tenant to default. So this just looks like an extremely attractive investment. The next idea for how we might be able to increase our margins is through YouTube. So this channel, the Let's Build a Startup, is aimed at entrepreneurs and maybe parents, because we'll be discussing educational techniques in the future. And so I don't expect it to have a huge following. 1 million people watching this channel would be an amazing result, and I'd be very happy with that. We'd pretty much have every entrepreneur on the planet. But the problem is that viewership does not scale with the number of students that we're trying to educate. And so what would be really nice is to have a revenue stream that scales with the number of students that we teach. And the plan here is to have a separate educational channel, and this would be aimed at early childhood education. So one thing that we see is that CoComelon right now is the largest educational channel, and it is huge. So if we look here, it is number 3 in the world, right after Mr. Beast, and it has 162 million subscribers. So there are just a huge number of young kids watching CoComelon. And if we look at Khan Academy, we can see that even their popular videos from a long time ago, from 16 years ago, have only about 3 million views. And so what Khan Academy is doing, I think, is extremely valuable, but they're not getting to all the kids. And so there's really an opportunity to target educational videos at a much younger audience. And I think we could build something that would scale with the number of students in the school. The tricky part about an educational YouTube channel is how do you monetize? Because you can't just throw in a mid-roll ad and be done with it. That would just be extremely disruptive to the kids that are learning. And so we need some other clever way of enabling us to monetize the fact that lots of kids are watching our content. But we'll think about that later. Another way that we might be able to attract investors is by allowing them to invest in our most successful graduates. So remember, we're teaching entrepreneurship as a core part of the curriculum, starting at age 4. So by the time these kids graduate, some of them will have already built successful companies, and some will be on their way to building very successful companies. And among the people they trust most in the world will be their teacher, who's known them since they were in diapers. And so I think what might be attractive is the deal flow that can generate. And investors who invest in building the schools for those kids now, they will have first pick at investing in our students. And separately, we can improve profitability for our own business by directly investing in our own graduates. Another way that we might be able to increase the margins of our business is to convince states to offer bonuses based on performance. Today, the way charter schools work is you get a fixed amount per student no matter how well they do. So there's really no incentive to go above and beyond. The only incentive is that if you do really poorly, you lose your permit. And so what we want is a system where if our school is really good, if we build the best school in the region, we should get a disproportionate amount of funding, which will allow us to expand that system since it's clearly working. Another great policy would be to offer a payment to charter schools based on the proportion of lifetime taxes that their students pay. So any student that graduates, we get a percentage of their taxes. This has a huge alignment of incentives because it not only encourages the schools to teach their students really well, it also encourages the schools to find ways to make sure that the students stay in the country after they graduate. Remember that problem where the state that's investing in you to educate you is not necessarily the same one that's collecting your taxes, and a policy like this would fix that problem. Now, there are some tricky bits here, which is that if you have this policy, there would be an incentive for teachers to select the students that they pick. If I was a mediocre teacher that didn't try very hard, I would still be able to choose kids that I know will pay a high lifetime amount of tax and be able to maximize my returns that way. And so we don't want that to be possible. So we need to couple this with some clauses that make it very difficult for teachers to choose which students they teach. But overall, I think this would be a huge policy improvement. Another way that we might be able to increase margins just slightly is that school is empty for 2 months of the year, but we're still paying rent on it. And so what we could do is maybe run it as a venue and do something useful out of the building while we're not using it. And finally, some of our expenses can be replaced with students doing their own work in the context of learning. So for example, here we're paying, where's the catering? We're paying $20,000 a year for catering. And at the same time, students are not learning how to cook in school. So I never learned how to cook. I am a terrible cook. That is such a useful life skill that was never taught to me in school. And what you could do is like Food Fridays, where every student is, Monday through Thursday, they get their own lunch and breakfast served. But on Fridays, they get the ingredients, but they have to make their own lunch and breakfast. And the teacher is teaching the students these useful life skills. And at the same time, we can lower our catering bill a little bit and make the school more profitable. Another example is that teaching is not taught in school. We want our students to be great teachers when they graduate. And one of the requirements to become a great teacher is you have to teach. And so we might pair up, let's say 10-year-olds with 3-year-olds and have the 10-year-olds teach the 3-year-olds one-on-one. And so that relieves burden from the teacher and the helpers and allows us in the future to either have slightly larger class sizes or a slightly smaller number of helpers per class. That's it for this week's episode of Let's Build a Startup. I know we covered a lot of numbers, and so if you have any questions or feedback or comments, please leave them below. I do answer every single one. And next week, we're gonna build our prototype. So we wanna build a proof of concept that we can quickly show to somebody and where they'll immediately click and just understand what we're trying to build. And so we'll see you next week on Let's Build a Startup.